Welcome to Realty Talk, the show that brings together the country's most authoritative and respected property experts. Follow us on all the socials and subscribe for updates and exclusive offers. Realty Talk is powered by realty.com.au, connecting buyers, sellers and agents differently.
Hello and welcome to the show. What a momentous show it was last week when Bushy and I caught up and we talked about my reminiscences and his thoughts over the last decade. Well, he's back with me again. I'm back with Bushy again. I can't help myself, Bushy. I've just sort of always got to take over. How are you doing?
Really good, mate. I'm really excited about the fantastic milestone that you achieved, mate. And we've got some stellar guests that we're going to talk to on the show today.
Yeah, well, in fact, I just got to mention here that I'm only sticking around for this show and the next one. And then it's, back to you, mate. Flick the chair back. But you'll have to restrain me a bit because I do tend to take over just a bit. But, hey, we've got some stellar guests this week in the show. We're going to talk to Tim Lawless in just a moment. Tim, of course, from CoreLogic. And we've actually chosen these three people today because they've been with us for so long. They've been with the show almost for its entire series, its entire running. The first one is Tim Lawless from CoreLogic. Always a good contributor. Bushy, isn't he?
He's a fantastic. He's really driven the way data now influences the decisions for everyone in the property industry. So he's been a pioneer and a real disruptor as far as that goes. And really looking forward to having a chat to Margaret Lomas as well, Kevin, given that she was actually on your very first show so many years ago.
She was indeed. And I think I caught up with her when she was writing her second book. Just getting back to Tim Lawless for a minute. I first met Tim prior to CoreLogic when he was with PRD. PRD Research, I think it was then. And so was, there's quite a few people who went from PRD across to CoreLogic. But Margaret Lomas, I caught up with her, I think she came to an outside broadcast I was doing at 4BC. That's the first time I'd actually met her, and she came and she and Ruben, her husband, sat in the caravan with me as we did an outside broadcast. There was absolutely no one there because it was like a land release. And it was really just Ruben, Margaret, and myself in this caravan. And we were there for 2 hours. It was great. It was the first time I'd met her. So I look forward to catching up and reminiscing with her as well. And then we got Louie Christopher.
Yeah, good old Louie from Sqm Research. What I love about Louie is he tells it exactly how it is, regardless of what people think. So you certainly don't get it sugar-coated with Louie. And his research is second to none. So he's been very good at picking trends over the years, and I'm sure he'll have some very interesting stuff to share with us today, Kevin.
Indeed he will. And without further ado, we'll go to a quick break. We'll come back and we'll be talking to Tim Lawless. Stick around, back in a minute. Successful property investment is a game of finance. Do you have the right team and the right game plan? Realty Talk is brought to you by Know How Property. More than mortgage brokers, Bushy Martin and his team of investment architects set you up with a sustainable strategy structured to lower your costs, tax, risk and stress while increasing your capacity for growth. Know How has helped over 1,900 homeowners and investors secure more than $800 million in property wealth. So get set to live more, work less, and live your legacy. Want to know how to invest in your freedom? Visit knowhowproperty.com.au. Welcome back to the show. And as I said in the opening there with Bushy, our first guest is Tim Lawless from CoreLogic. And mate, it's a delight always to talk to you. How are you doing, Tim?
Really well. Thank you, Kevin. And thanks for inviting me on. And Bushy, g'day.
How are you, Tim?
A little while, I think, since we've had a chat, probably a few weeks at least, but I can't believe it's been so long.
Yeah, well, we've been doing this show for, well over a decade. And I think I met you even before you were at CoreLogic, Tim.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I started at RP Data back in 2007, right. And we'd had a long relationship well before then when I was at Colliers and PRD. So, interesting to see how things have evolved though from, was Zoom even a thing back then? Probably.
No,
not.
I don't think it was.
It wasn't.
Because in those days, those early days, the show was audio, it wasn't video. So, and that's when Zoom came along, and that was brilliant. Hey, mate, I wanted to ask you right up front, what are your early memories of some of our times together? What are the things that occur to you now?
Well, I think that the one thing that's always been a constant is Kevin Turner, obviously. You've been there through the rainy days and the sunny ones as well. So, yeah, absolutely. There's been some consistency in the Kevin Turner side of things, but it's great to see that expanding out now as well. But I think more broadly, the thing that's always struck me is just, the show is it's just so regular and high frequency. It's been able to move with the twists and turns in the market. It's very on trend. And that's been the most valuable thing for me, just being able to tune in and know exactly what's going on in the marketplace. And I think I can't think of any examples, but there's been so many times where I've tuned in and got to know about something that I didn't really know too much about that was already happening in the market, thanks to the fact that there are so many people joining the program, so many experts that have joined, really providing an on the ground, right at the coalface perspective of what's happening in the housing market.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, sorry, Bushy.
No, you're right, mate.
I think I mentioned last week in the show that we've done about 5,000 interviews, and going back over some of the early ones, there's still some really great lessons in those that are current today too, Tim. Absolutely, and a lot of the anecdotes and the strategies in property don't change. Even though we've seen a lot of change in technology and the market's been through plenty of cycles over this time, I think the fundamentals of investing and buying and selling really don't change. Sure, there's going to be some different tactics and taking advantage of some of the new technologies and the way we're seeing even a lot more properties moving to online auctions, for example, and a lot of the virtual tours that have become normal now. At the end of the day, you really want to make sure that you're positioning your property the best you possibly can in the market when you're selling, and when you're buying, you're getting the best possible price. And I think just year in, year out, that doesn't really change at all.
Yeah, well, you've been at the forefront of some major change in terms of the way data is now helping everyone in the property industry make much better and more informed decisions, Tim. So what else have you seen that's changed in property investment over the last decade, and what do you think's influenced those changes?
Well, it's such a good point. I mean, the quality and the depth and the timeliness of the data has been just a fundamental shift over the past 10, 15, even 20 years. I think going back to the early days of RP Data, RP Data was founded by Ray Catlin back in the early to mid 90s. And back then, it was simply a resource used by real estate agents that gave them access to data about what properties were selling for. And you might recall one of the first big projects we did was we took a photo of every single property around the country. Essentially, guys on one guy driving a motorbike, another guy in the back taking a photo and geotagging it. That was revolutionary for its time, like a decade before Google Street View. But since then, we've seen companies like CoreLogic and a lot of competitors springing out of the ground as well, just adding so much value to that base level of data. So the government obviously collects all the transactional data, but the real value comes in, adding to the timeliness of it, adding context from, say, spatial overlays, adding aerial imagery, adding elevations, looking at zoning and town planning. And then, of course, overlaying all the different AI and machine learning are the most recent examples of how data's quality is being improved, and then estimating the value and so forth. So I think there's still a long way to go for data quality to still continue to improve. But looking back to where it was 10 years ago, it's absolutely been a significant change in how we can analyze property markets. And along the way, we've also seen a lot more methodologies introduced. 10 years ago, we were just starting to move out of the mainstream usage of property data was deriving a median price, really simplistic way of looking at the market, all the way through to now where we have hedonic regressions, we have stratified medians, we have repeat sales indices, all really useful for different purposes. So I think for anybody investing or selling or active in the market anyway, there's been this real improvement in the way we can actually estimate the value of properties and get a bit of a guide for what we should be or shouldn't be paying for a property in the marketplace.
Yeah, those early days that you mentioned there, Tim, about how revolutionary what that was, and we're going around taking photographs and so on. I do recall when the internet really started to gather pace, real estate agents lost that power of the information. You know, there was so much information there, and they were the gatekeepers of that. And then API data sort of opened all that up. Because I remember when I first started in real estate, we have to do title searches and things like that just to get information so we could actually do a listing. But the internet certainly opened it up. And I think full marks to you and your organisation too, in the way that you've involved the consumer in keeping that data alive, you know, giving them the opportunity to go in and how have you improved your property. And that's going to have a real key influence on the value as well, Tim.
Yeah, absolutely. I think transparency is really important in housing, and to have the real estate industry, you know, empowered to see all that data was certainly a good thing. It helped real estate agents really, when they're listing a property, to really get the best value and provide a benchmark to the prospective vendor about what a property was going to be listed for. But for a consumer not being able to see the same side of things, I think they were quite disempowered in many ways. And as you say, the internet and a lot of consumer websites where you can actually get a lot of this information for free has really empowered the consumer side of things, but it's also made their decision-making a lot more complex. There's a lot of data to choose from, and quite often it can be showing different things in the market as well. So definitely my advice to consumers would be find the source that you're confident with and comfortable with and stick to it, because you can get a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there now. It's gone full other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's the curation and the interpretation of that data that is the real art and skill these days, Tim. But tell us, what have been your top property takeaways and learnings over the last 10 years or so?
Yeah, man, there's so many. Trying to cast my mind back a couple of years ago is hard, to be honest, Bushy. But over the last 10 years, I think the most important thing is to remember that time heals all wounds. Even in some of these extreme housing markets we've seen over the past decade, like the mining town boom and then the spectacular crash of mining regions, we're just starting to see some of these regions finally move into a nominal recovery now, more than nearly 10 years after the peak in those markets. So the market is very cyclical. I think it's probably the most important thing to remember. And a lot of people try to time their purchasing with the cycles of the market, which is notoriously hard. Easy in retrospect, but I think for anybody buying to the marketplace of the last 10 years, if you've bought into the marketplace on your own timeframes and just working to your own budget, chances are, if you've held on to that property long enough, you've probably done pretty well out of it. So probably time is the most important thing. Time in the market rather than trying to time the market is critical, I think, for anybody looking to get in. No doubt, people who have timed the market well and intentionally done so, hats off to them. You can really make a lot of money buying at the bottom and buying at the top. And to Warren Buffett's words of being greedy when others are cautious is probably has got a lot to do with it. But there is a bit of risk in that as well. So I think most people just simply, you're not going to be able to time the market as well as what everybody would like to be able to. The other thing I think over the past 10 years or so is just looking at the different performance of the markets. I was having a look at some of the data just before we came onto the call to see which markets have actually doubled in value over the past 10 years, because a lot of people still have this, I guess, this rule of thumb in the back of their mind that they should see their property value double every 10 years. Generally, that's more the exception rather than the norm, at least over the past 10 years. It's only been Sydney and Hobart where, on average, we've seen housing prices rise more than 100% in a 10-year period of time. In fact, look at somewhere like Perth. You can see Perth housing values are only up about 15% over the past 10 years. Go to regional WA, and they're still a little bit down on where they were over 10 years. Go to somewhere like a Brisbane, which has generally been a really strong market, but over 10 years, housing values are up about 71%. So, there is a lot of diversity in the market. And my guess looking forward is a lot of these markets that have underperformed over the past, say, 10 years might be the markets to actually look at over the next 10 years, because they generally tend to show very good value and higher yields, much more affordable entry price as well.
Yeah, that is a nice segue into our next question of you, Tim. And I want you to take the crystal ball out now. Have a look at the next 5 to 10 years. You gave us a great example there of what's happened over the last 10 and how that may not happen in the next 10, or it might be totally the reverse. What do you think are the big influences over the next decade?
Yeah, I think that the biggest one is going to be affordability. We know even over the past 10 years, housing affordability has been front and center. And affordability has become very challenging in markets like Sydney and Melbourne, not necessarily in paying down your mortgage. That's generally been pretty straightforward. When I talk about affordability, it's more about getting your foot in the door, being able to fund your deposit and your transactional costs. And thanks to very low interest rates, once you're in the market, servicing the mortgage has generally been pretty straightforward for most. In fact, we've typically seen mortgage arrears in Australia over the past 10 years holding well below the 1% mark, which is quite phenomenal. Going forward, I think affordability will still be some focus. We probably will be moving through a bit of a down phase over the next, say, 12 to 18 months. So affordability will naturally improve through that time. We'll also see higher wages growth as well coming through, which will help to improve people's ability to get into the market. And of course, from a government policy side of things, we are starting to see the government really focusing on improving home ownership. Maybe that's just as we lead into a federal election, but I think there is some seriousness there from both sides of the political fence to help more people get into the market. But the underlying issues around housing affordability, there's a lot more to be done rather than just giving people a leg up into the market. On the supply side of things, I wouldn't be surprised if we do start to see a lot more focus on town planning, trying to bring in more densities, for example, along the transport spines, especially in the most expensive cities like Sydney and Melbourne, seeing some of those areas densified, not necessarily high-rise, although I think there will be a lot of that, but a lot more focus on medium-rise, townhomes, that type of thing, really just trying to get better usage of, the highest and best use of land along those major infrastructure nodes where people are getting in and out of the cities. I think the other thing to look for over the next 10 years is going to be the role of technology. We've already seen that ramping up over the last few years with a lot more people utilizing things like virtual tours of homes, using drones a lot more, even using technology to map out the internals of a home, producing floor plans and so forth, using a lot more of that drone photography to provide indications around the position of a property, the roofing materials, the overall layout of a property on the block itself, its orientation. And then even going forward even further, from the data side of things, we are expecting there's going to be a lot more focus in things like machine learning and AI, providing an even better focus on estimating values and understanding where housing trends are going, and taking those methodologies to the next level, harnessing all this new computer power and storage ability that we're seeing from the cloud as well.
Yeah, tell me, COVID's really shaken up the way we live and work over the last couple of years. Projecting forward, are you seeing other changes and trends in the way we actually live and work and do the way we do, and what's likely to impact on this as you see it moving forward in the way property is going to be bought and sold in the future, Tim?
It's been remarkable, hasn't it, just through COVID and how we've really seen that change in living environments and working environments fast-tracked. In many ways, we've seen a real improvement in housing affordability because people have been empowered and enabled to move a little bit further from where they work. Regional population, I think, is going to be something, or regional population growth is going to be something that's at least semi-permanent, as we see more and more employers enabling their staff to work remotely at least part of the time. I know at CoreLogic, we've formalized our hybrid working policy. We expect staff to be in the office a couple of days a week, but they can work remotely the rest of it. And inherently, that's going to be flexible. So for those industry sectors where people can work remotely, obviously it doesn't work for every industry. And I think we are going to see some permanency to people being able to live in the outer fringes of the cities or the regional markets, that probably puts a lot of these commutable regional areas in a really good position. So if you're within, say, a 2-hour commute of one of the major capitals, be it a Newcastle or a Wollongong or the Blue Mountains outside of Sydney or the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast or Toowoomba and Southeast Queensland, I think these markets have structurally changed. Or the demand in these markets has structurally changed. We will see more people looking for those lifestyle qualities, but also the commutability along with the livability, driving demand into these areas. The affordability of a lot of these regions has also, been diminished because of that higher demand. No longer can we say that a lot of these really popular lifestyle markets provide an affordability advantage, because quite often they're on par with some of the blue chip areas of the capital city counterparts now.
Based on those thoughts, Tim, what do you think the lessons will be here for people who aren't in the market right now, but are planning to get in either principal place of residence or maybe start to build a portfolio? What do you see those influences? How will that impact them?
Yeah, it's a lot of people talk about it's more and more components of the market are being blocked from access to the market, which I don't really agree with. People's attitudes and preferences on housing is going to have to adapt. Not everybody can afford to buy a detached house. So that's kind of back to my point a bit earlier on around densification and different types of housing options. I think a lot more first home buyers, for example, will be choosing to densify rather than maybe buying into the outer fringes, for example, especially if they need to commute to work every day. So buying into a townhome or an apartment and then building up some equity in that initial purchase to then upgrade into a detached home or somewhere closer to the city or closer to the water sounds like the logical way that people will engage with the marketplace, at least initially, and combat affordability constraints. I think also when you look at, say, people engaging with the marketplace, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more and more people buying sight unseen. And this is something that we've obviously seen through COVID, and it's again been enabled by technology. People were able to actually, virtually tour a property and get probably just as much detail from a virtual inspection, maybe with somebody there who could be doing their building inspection and the pest inspection on behalf of them, of course, but getting probably just as good a feel for the quality of the property and the nuances of a property without even being there. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that even taken to the next level as we see more and more technologies enabling people to inspect the property without having to actually be there. Of course, we probably will see more foreign buyers coming back into Australia as well. We're already seeing a trend towards more foreign buying activity, still a little bit less than what it was pre-COVID, but I wouldn't be surprised as overseas borders reopen and we start to see foreign students returning and migration picking up again. We do start to see some renewed interest from overseas buying as well. And of course, being able to virtually inspect a property is going to go a long way to supporting that.
Yeah, brilliant. Kevin has certainly been right at the centre of what's been happening in property over the last 10 years. But how do you see Realty Talk helping to enable the future that you're talking about as a trusted voice of property in the days over the next 10 years, Tim?
It's exactly the same. I'd be really surprised if you guys could do anything better. So it's just staying on the cutting edge of trends, engaging with all the various experts in the marketplace, be it if they're real estate agents or buyers agents or data experts or economists, policymakers. You've done all that, and I think it's the most important thing is just staying on trends, keeping the marketplace informed about what's happening with property trends and different changes in policy, in technology. I think you guys have done that extraordinarily well, and it's kind of why try to fix something that isn't broken, if you know what I mean. So yeah, I'd see it. The trend or the future of real estate talk really emulating the past. It's really just doing exactly the same things that you're doing.
Well, mate, I've got to say we wouldn't be where we are if it wasn't for people like you who've so willingly given us so much wonderful commentary over the years. So, Tim, personally, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I look forward to us working, even closer with you in the years to come. So, Tim, all the best, mate, and thanks again for your support.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, Bushy. And look
Tim.
forward to this conversation in 10 years' time, eh?
Yeah, indeed.
Absolutely.
I'd like
We'll
to
just
think
have less hair.
in 10 years' time. Yeah, that's right. Good on you, mate. Thank you. Hey, stay with us because straight after this very short break, Bushy and I will be back with Margaret Lomas. See you then. Property deductions can save you thousands of dollars each year. To make sure you maximise deductions, you need to work with the most experienced quantity surveyor in the country. BMT Tax Depreciation is the leading specialist in the industry. They've completed over 700,000 tax deduction schedules for residential investment and commercial properties Australia-wide. BMT guarantee to find double your fee in the first full financial year deductions. Call BMT on 1300 728 726 today for an obligation-free quote. Welcome back to the show, and I'm delighted that our next guest is someone who I've known very well for almost my entire real estate career, Margaret Lomas. G'day, Margaret. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And, you know, Kevin, I have on my wall at home a photograph of you and me in the 4BC studios in Brisbane. And I think it was taken, oh my gosh, 20 years ago, possibly more than that.
Yeah.
Probably 22, 23 years ago, because we both look really young in it.
Yeah. Well, we're both still very young. Hey, Bushy, as I mentioned to you at the opening of the show, you know, I've known Margaret for such a long time. And one of the things that I recall, Margaret, was an interview that I did with you and Ruben joined me. And we were at an outside broadcast in the caravan. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
We were the only ones there.
I know. It was the first of a number of outside broadcasts I did, and it was a great one for me to learn on. But yeah, just us. But we had a good time anyway.
We had a great time. In fact, I think you were there for the whole show, the whole 2 hours.
Yeah, indeed. I didn't have anything else to do that day. So.
Well, it's interesting, Margaret. We were looking back. Just recently at what's happened over the 500 shows, and you were one of the very first guests on the very first show, Margaret.
That's right.
Yeah, that's correct. I've been around for a long time now. I guess if you think about it and you go back that far to even when I wrote my first book in 2001, when I thought I was a property expert then, but I probably wasn't really. I was only a couple of steps ahead of other people, really. But back then, there really wasn't anyone writing about property investing. Jan Summers had released a book called Real Estate Investing, I think, or something, I can't remember the title, but it was really more about the physical process of visiting a property, looking for the right things in that property. And it was more about the way we would buy a house, I guess, to live in, and maybe that house down the street to invest in when we're ready to do so. And I remember at the time thinking, there's just so much more people need to know about investing in property, including what happens with your tax and where is the best place to buy. Is down the road or next door or the block behind you really the right thing for you as an investor? What happens long term, and how do you set yourself up for that long-term future by knowing more about how to buy property? And that was the motivation behind writing that first book. And I guess I'm still here. So
8 books later.
Yes.
Hey, Bushy, we are going to talk to Margaret about the last 10 years and also projecting forward for the next 10 years. But I might just go off script for a little while if we could, because I think something that Margaret has talked about before we came on air demonstrates a wonderful point. And that is that no matter how long we're in this business, we're never too old to learn. And I think, Margaret, your book, your latest book, which is what I'd like to pick up on now, is a classic example of that, how after all these years, you've written a book now, and I want you to tell us what it's about, because I think many, many people are going to be interested in this. But you learned so much from writing this book.
Oh, wow. It was such a journey for me. As you know, I've got quite a lot of property, and I guess a natural next step for me and certainly many other property investors, was to think about whether I wanted to take some of those ones that I had on bigger blocks and develop them into more than one unit, be it 2, 3 or 4. And I did have a corner block down in South Australia that I knew lent itself to 4 when I bought it. I didn't buy it for that reason, but I knew that that could have been a possible outcome down the track. But I knew nothing about developing. I know a lot about property investing, but I didn't know anything about property developing. But one of my regular guests on my show, Peter Kalizos, he runs a property development course at TAFE in South Australia. And so I asked him whether he would be interested in co-writing the book with me, but making it like a diary of my journey as a developer myself. I just thought there's no better way to learn something than to do it and to have someone guide you, but to go through all the trials and tribulations. So we agreed to do that about 4 years ago, thinking we'd be 12 months in the book. The idea was that I would start my development and I would diarise it. So every couple of days, I'd write up what we'd been through and what we were doing. And then Peter would summarise with, well, this is how you should be doing it all. And these are your steps. He has these 10 steps for developing a property. And I was going to undertake the 10 steps. Well, little did we know that every single problem that could have come up and every barrier we could have faced, we did face during our journey. It took me 4 years to get the development finalised, which in itself is a fabulous lesson for anyone wanting to take it on, because that means money is tied up. You're paying interest on debt if you've got debt to do this. It means that, you've got no income coming in while you're spending all of this time on the development. And I learned so much about developing, councils, surveying. I didn't really even know what a contour was. I mean, I sort of did, but the relevance of a contour on a plan, I wouldn't have been able to read a plan. And I certainly didn't understand many town plans to the degree that you need to be a small developer. And we got through it all, finished the book, and it's like a thriller novel to read.
Well, it's interesting. It just reinforces the point that while development can look very easy on paper, it's certainly not for the faint-hearted. And if someone's as experienced and as expert as you has still had those roller coaster rides over that 4-year period, it's certainly a warning notice for others who are thinking this is going to be easy, particularly in the current environment where the construction industry is really in turmoil. And things are taking a lot longer than they normally are. So I can't wait to get my hands on it, Margaret, and have a good read.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think we summed it all up by saying everything that could go wrong did go wrong, even a pandemic. And hopefully other people don't have to develop a property through a pandemic. But we've learned now that you just can't know. Everything can go wrong and probably will.
Actually, a question for you, Margaret. Knowing what you know now, roll back the clock 4 years, would you have done it?
I think so, because for me, there's an element of timing in that although it took forever, the timing ended up being good because we had that property boom in both of the areas that I was developing. Yeah. Let me give you an example. The New South Wales development, which is a house with dual key for holiday letting, and it's also a lesson in whether you should holiday let, and a granny flat behind it. So it's essentially potentially 3 permanent rentals or 3 holiday rentals. The bank had said it was going to value at 1.1 million as at the time it was finished. And that's what I was in for when I thought of, and it was a block I'd owned with an old shack for 20 years. So when you take into account what I'd paid for it originally and what the loan was at, and then the cost to build, then I was in for the 1.1. We couldn't make any mistakes on that. There was going to be no equity that I gained out of that. I had to do it because the old shack needed to be gone and I wanted to improve the cash flow on it. But about 6 months after it was finished, the bank revalued it at 2 million. So, and that was not because I'd had such a fabulous house, although it is a fabulous house. It's because of the boom. The boom gave us an extra 800,000 just in that probably in that last year of the development. Similar in the South Australia, not to such a great degree. The bank said we'd have a $350,000 house, and then they valued it at $430,000 at the end. So we got equity that we didn't expect. I would do it again, but I think the process would be shorter, because part of the problem, and this is clearly outlined in the book, is that I'm a busy person, and it was actually a bad time for me to take on developing. So it took me longer, because weeks would go by where I was so busy I wouldn't do anything or follow up. And then I'd follow up and find out there was a problem, and then I'd have to deal with that problem. So we probably could have compressed it into 2 years if I'd been less busy and if there was a more appropriate time in my life to be doing that development.
Fascinating. What's the book called, Margaret?
It's called Diary of a Small Property Developer.
Okay.
And you can get it from the shop on my website, destiny.com.au, or from Amazon. Amazon also has it, and it's in Kindle, the whole ebook thing as well. Right.
Destiny.com.au. Hey, Margaret, let's get down to the nitty-gritty of what we wanted to talk to you about, but that was fascinating. So thank you for sharing that with us. The last 10 years, what have you noticed?
Wow, a lot's changed, and some things have stayed the same as well. I think the things that I've seen changing is that it's been 10 years of a very low interest rate environment. And when we first began helping people to buy property, we were helping people to buy property in an 8% interest rate environment. And so the capacity for a property to deliver a positive cash flow was very limited. And if you needed a positive cash flow, the focus was very much on getting a property in an area with a high relative rent return, while it wasn't getting that because it was a one industry town. So, still plenty of opportunity for growth, but a property that also had high on-paper depreciation, because both that higher rent and the on-paper depreciation would plug up that hole for you, so that the 8% you were paying, you could come pretty close to covering. Of course, today, with such low interest rates, you'd be struggling to get a property that didn't give you at least an even cash flow, unless it was in a big city and at a very high price with an extremely low relative rent. So that's the first thing that's changed, I think. You getting a good cash flow on your property is far easier than it ever was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. I think the other thing is that people are definitely more informed than they were. When I first started to help people to buy property, nobody knew anything about buying investment property except that you'd find a house and buy it. Pretty much that was it. People didn't understand that there's a whole economic component behind the decisions that you make that can be the difference between buying a property that does well over time and buy one that's a lemon for you. And that economic component is split up into many areas that need a lot of research. I think people know that now, and people are definitely more informed, and they're asking a lot more questions. I think the other thing that's happened recently, and certainly over the last 10 years, is that people are busier than they used to be. And that means that they want people to do everything for them, which is fine, except it's also a trap and a big risk, because if you're not going to be involved in the journey that you take to invest in property, you'll never learn anything, and you're putting yourself at far greater risk of the spruikers taking advantage of you and, just selling you a property that's good for them because of the commissions, but not appropriate for your personal financial circumstances. I think probably, the last couple of things that have changed is that the country feels like it's become smaller, in that there are more borderless investors. People are happier to invest outside of their own state, and they certainly weren't 10 years ago. It was difficult to get anyone to realise that the best property for them might not be in the state where they live, and certainly not in the suburb that they live in. And the last thing is that there's been, as you would know, some legislative changes that have impacted when you're buying property. So the biggest one being the change to depreciation and that plant and equipment. Prior to 10 years ago, if you bought a property, you could get a secondhand value on everything inside that property, and that helped you with that cash flow. Now you can't get that unless you buy the item yourself as new. And I think that hasn't hurt anyone yet, because we do have those low interest rates and cash flow is easier to get. But once interest rates start going up, we'll notice that the benefits we used to get from that immediate deduction from that plant and equipment, that's gone, and it's going to hurt a little bit, I think.
Yeah, very good points. If you look back on the last decade, then Margaret, what have been your top property takeaways and learnings over this time?
Oh, gosh, there's just so many. It's difficult. And I know you don't have a couple of hours on the show, but I think, as I said, people prefer to have things done for them, but there's still so many spruikers out there whose first desire is to make a commission from those people. And I think most viewers of this show would be shocked to find that some of the biggest names that you might know in property investing as property investment advisors or buyer's agents don't find the right property for you. They will have either contact with a developer who develops property in a specific area that might be okay, but not necessarily okay for you. Or they might be just a single buyer's agent who can only work in one area at a time and basically is negotiating as many purchases in that one area as they can and getting as many clients to buy those properties. And the problem with this is that everybody is different. So there's no such thing as the right investment property. It's the right investment property for you. Some properties will grow sooner rather than later. Some properties will have a low cash flow, some will have a high cash flow. And some people are closer to retirement than others. And you have to think about all of those things before you invest in anything, particularly property. And you have to know where to buy according to your personal circumstances. So I think the big takeaway that I have gotten from the last 10 years is that the majority of people still don't understand that. And that's why they're still getting caught by the spruikers and still paying too much for properties that were never right for them in the first place and then being disappointed in the outcome. It hasn't turned out well for them. I think the other good thing that I've learned over the years from observing areas that do very well and why is that families are definitely the big anchor to growth over time. So we get two kinds of growth. We get growth in property that comes from that emotion that comes in a boom. And we're seeing that at the moment. And we've just come through that in Sydney and Melbourne. Fear of missing out, a lot of emotion goes into that. We get a very short, sharp boom, and then we get plateauing. Sydney between 2003 and 2010 barely grew. It grew by 8% over that whole time, whereas other cities grew very well. Adelaide, for example, did a very good amount of growth during that time. So that's the emotional growth. And then if you're an investor with a little bit of time on your side, we get that organic growth that comes from families. And the thing about organic growth is it occurs year in, year out over time. And over time, it adds up to be better than that short boom growth. So what families do is when they find an area that they like, they move in, and because they have children who are in school for 12 years, they stay there for 12 to 20 years, depending on how many children they have. And because they stay there, if it is an area that's got a lot of amenity, that offers good lifestyle opportunity, gives you reasonable commute to work, these days that's not as crucial. But if it's an area like that, they stay there and they don't move out, which automatically puts pressure on prices because other people want to move in, but there's no housing available for those people. So that family demographic is probably the most critical driver of growth.
Fascinating. Hey, Margaret, we spoke to Tim Lawless earlier in the show and we talked to him about innovations and what's happened and how that's changing our lifestyle. He talked a lot about technical innovations, but I'm wondering about lifestyle innovations and how you see that shaping the way property investment's going to be in the future in terms of, let's have a look at what COVID's done. And you just touched on the fact that traveling to work is now no longer as important because we can be very remote. What impacts do you see that happening over the next decade?
I want to bring up something that might be a little bit, controversial in its thought process. But I know everybody's saying, well, COVID's changed it and now we're all looking for lifestyle. But if you go back over the last 60 years, you'll actually see a pattern that occurs. And that pattern is that the parents move out to the suburbs because that's where they can get the cheaper housing and there's some lifestyle offered by moving in the suburbs. And then the children all want to move back and live in the cities because they don't want to, they're sick of living out where there's nothing, and they all move back into the cities. And then their children hate living in the cities, so they move out to the suburbs. And then their children hate living in the suburbs, so they move back into the cities. So it's actually been quite cyclic over a long time, where we see the demand shifting between lifestyle choices and tree changes and then back to inner city urban living. And Canada has a very good example of a period of time in the 70s where urban living became the thing, and there was a huge amount of urban living, high-rise apartments that were created, similar to some of the developments that are happening in and around Green Square and Mascot in Sydney, where it's not just an apartment block, it's a community that is developed with a shopping centre on the ground floor and parklands and pools and gyms. Then that originally began in Canada in the 70s, and we saw them hugely popular. And then by the time we got to the late 90s, early 2000s, they had huge vacancy in them, and people didn't want to live in them anymore because they wanted to go back out into the suburbs and into the more country areas. So we do see this as a cycle anyway, and I think COVID has just exacerbated that this time around, whereas people now don't feel that they need to commute as much and they're looking for that lifestyle. I think we're going to go back to where we were. I think people will get back into the cities. I think people will go back to wanting to go to work again. A lot of people I know have said, I'm sick of staying home. I want to get on a train and go to work. And I think we will go back to that again. And that might be a bit of a controversial thought, but we need to keep in mind that this cycle exists. And therefore, if we're thinking of a long-term property investment, don't buy what's right for today, buy what will be right for tomorrow.
Yeah, brilliantly said. So drilling down into that, and a great insight, by the way, in terms of that cyclic nature. What do you think this means for property owners and those planning to buy a home or an investment property over the next 10 years then?
Look, there's a lot of things that people do need to think about, but the fundamentals don't ever change. Let's not forget that. So the fundamentals are, of course, as I said already, those families and that family demographic. If you don't get the best growth in property from buying in an area rich in families, you won't get a lemon either. So it's a sure thing to me to buy in those areas where we have those families, where we have a council who is interested in providing amenity, where we don't have too much new land. That's always a bit of a risk factor over time, because people would often rather build their own home than buy another property or someone else's property. So we're also talking about areas where we don't have an abundance of new land to be released. And you can work that out by talking to the council what their planned future releases are. Yep. But if we think about the family demographic, on top of that, we've got some really basic demographics that are very easy to identify, or basic factors. So we need to have either jobs or jobs accessible. So if there's no jobs in the area, and the Central Coast is a good example, we don't have a lot of jobs in the area, but 60% of the workforce commute to Sydney for their job. Of course, at the moment, they're probably only commuting half the time, but there's jobs accessible to the Central Coast, which explains the Central Coast very good growth over recent times. Plus, we have that lifestyle amenity. So we need the jobs. We need the population to be growing, and I like a population growing faster than the national average growth as well. That usually means your growth is going to come a little bit sooner. We need those lifestyle amenities in the schools as well, because if people don't have a school that they can send their children to, they will move, and if they don't get what they need on the weekends, they'll move. So you need the restaurants, and you need the sporting facilities for the kids, and families are very child-centred these days, remember. In my day, I raised 5 children, and the children were, got what they needed, but they certainly weren't pushed forward. These days, everything is about the kid. So think about those areas that satisfy things that kids need, dance schools, sporting clubs, all sorts of, they have all the big indoor gyms for kids. There's a lot of stuff like that these days that you need to think about. So those fundamentals for the next 10 years won't change. You will definitely need those. But I think when you think about the kind of property you need to buy, there are some things that people are now looking for that they didn't in the past. And it's interesting because the big gourmet kitchens aren't as popular anymore. And space for that big gourmet kitchen, because you don't need a big gourmet kitchen to cook HelloFresh or to get Uber Eats, which is pretty much what many young families subsist on these days. So the big kitchen is being given over for better workspaces. So rather than the desk shoved up in the corner of the dining room that you used to make do with for doing that little bit of work you had to do after work, people now want the fully resourced home office and a big space for that. And if it's a mum and a dad both working, or a dad and a dad, or a mum and a mum both working, then you need those big spaces for two people or even two of them. So if I was buying a house, I would definitely be looking for houses that can lend itself to that sort of thing. Backyards, people used to say, the more land, the more valuable the house. That's not so much the case anymore, because there's no difference in value really between a 650 square metre block and an 800 square metre block, unless you can subdivide the 800 square metre one. If you can't subdivide it, then the kids don't use the backyards the way we used to, and all they represent to busy parents is extra work on the weekends, having to mow the grass and keep your backyards good as well. So I think I'd think about that too. More house, less yard, and certainly close to all of those amenities.
Wonderful. Margaret, you've been such an important part of this show for, the whole time I've been doing it. I just want to thank you, but I also would love to ask you, what do you see as the future for, this show, Realty Talk, and others like it? I mean, how can we, is there anything we can do to change, or do we need to make any changes?
No, look, I don't think so. I think it's really important for shows like yours and mine to be careful about who we have on as well, and you always are, and so am I. There's no coincidence behind the fact that I only have a small number of people who I get to come on my show. It's because I want people who legitimately can educate others on how to buy well, rather than people with an agenda. I can remember one of the TV stations having a couple of property shows on, and they would just parade a series of developers and property spruikers through as their guests. And all it does is confuse people about the legitimacy of the information that they're getting. So I think what you're doing at the moment is the right thing. Continuing to want to provide education to people, to want to be able to be sure that people aren't getting stuck with bad property, and from time to time even exposing the scams. You and I have had frequent times where we've talked about the kinds of scams that people get caught up in, and how to avoid getting caught up in those scams, and the questions to ask to make sure that you're protected. And I think shows like yours go a long way toward helping people to be protected.
Margaret, thank you so much. Yeah, Margaret, thank you so much for your support over the years too. And, this is not the end of the journey. We're going to hopefully get a lot more years left in us yet, but thank you so much.
Well, you have to wonder that, don't you? You and I are just getting really old now, Kevin. How much longer can we do this?
Oh, well, I see, the thing about it, I spoke to Bushy about this, is that I really enjoy it. So it kind of keeps me young.
Yes.
I get up in the morning and I knew I was going to interview you and couple of other people, and that really gets me pumped. I really enjoy that. So,
well, Kevin, Tuesday nights for me is my dancing night. So I do 4 hours on a Tuesday night. I do hip hop, tap, and jazz with a group of fairly, when I say young, certainly younger than me. I'm 62 soon. And when I'm there, I often say to my dance teacher, who's 30, how much longer is it okay for me to do this and not look silly? And he went, you just keep coming and keep doing what you're doing.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
Brilliantly done. Look, I want to thank both of you as a listener and now being actively involved in the show. You've both made very significant contributions to the industry in educating and guiding property investors and property professionals. And yourself, Margaret, you've done a fantastic job at lifting the professionalism of property players generally. So really, we thank you for your long-term support for the show and for joining us on Realty Talk today.
Thank you for having me, and it's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Bushy, and thank you, Margaret. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
And
stay with us. We've got lots more to come. Louie Christopher is going to be along after the break. Stay with us. Successful property investment is a game of finance. Do you have the right team and the right game plan? Realty Talk is brought to you by Know How Property. More than mortgage brokers, Bushy Martin and his team of investment architects set you up with a sustainable strategy structured to lower your costs, tax, risk and stress while increasing your capacity for growth. Know How has helped over 1,900 homeowners and investors secure more than $800 million in property wealth. So get set to live more, work less, and live your legacy. Want to know how to invest in your freedom? Visit knowhowproperty.com.au. Welcome back, and we're delighted in this part of the show to welcome another one of our very regular guests over the last decade, Louie Christopher from Sqm Research. G'day, Louie. How you doing?
G'day, Kevin. Nice to see you once again.
Yeah, mate, and they said it wouldn't last. But you've been with us almost since day one, Louie, and giving some tremendous insight into market statistics. I've always admired. I mean, so many people now talk of your reports are like benchmarks for where the industry's headed. So Bushy, one of the things I've spoken to Louie about over the years too is his ability to pick up on trends nice and early. And that's one of the things I think data gives us. Hey, Louie, can I just ask you before we launch into this, what are some of your early recollections about you and I working together over the years? Do you remember when your first interview was?
I think it was sometime circa 2010. And one of the things I recall, and I think it's a great credit to you, Kevin, is that, I've been somewhat cautious in terms of who I do interviews with. As you're well aware, I like to try and, as best I can, call a spade when the market's going up, whether it's going down. And generally, I remember first speaking with you, just checking you out to be sure that you see the world in the same light too. And that's one thing that I've really enjoyed over the time is being not afraid to call it straight, whether it's up, whether it's down.
Yeah.
And I think we're all on the same page of what's important for investors nowadays is to find out exactly what's going on, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think that's what has happened with your program over the years, just calling it straight. That's so important. And I've always had a strong belief, as I know both Bushy and yourself have, that it's really important to have a transparent market so people can make better investment decisions, and it's better for the industry as well.
Yeah, I can say as both a listener of the show for many years and enjoying your conversations, and then more recently having the privilege to host, Louie, that what I love about what you do is that you're often happy to say what many in the industry won't. And you call a spade a spade. We hear the truth directly from you, not the spin or the sensationalism that we see from many other commentators, and that's the thing that I've enjoyed the most. But tell me, Louie, over that last 10 years of the show, a bit more that the show's been operating, what has changed in property investment during that period, and what has influenced those changes as you've seen it?
Yes, enough of the good words. Let's get into the loathing. Look, what's changed for property investors over the years? Well, there's certainly been more information being able to be provided. I think when I first got involved in the industry, actually way back in 2000, really the only providers of information at the time were the real estate institutes, and maybe one or two small providers such as RP Data, it was known at the time, which they were just focused on Queensland only. Home Price Guide, which I originally worked for, which was only focusing on New South Wales. So I think what's changed for investors and all home buyers and home sellers is the proliferation of information over that time. It's definitely advanced, it's increased. But sadly, with that, it's become quite confusing because there are ourselves providing data, there is CoreLogic providing data, there is Domain providing data. Then there's a whole bunch of smaller outfits now that are on the scene. They're providing their take on the market. And so it's become, I think, a little bit confusing for investors in terms of what is actually going on. So that's one of the challenges for investors. But that said, those who do their research and understand the market and get some experience there are some great opportunities. I think overall too, the market has become more efficient in a similar way that the stock market has become. I think gone are the days where sellers can convince someone to pay 20% over and above the market. And I think the days are also gone where buyers think they can get a bargain 20% below the market. The market is the market. And with the additional information out there, a lot more buyers and sellers do understand where things are at right now.
Yeah, extremely well said.
Yeah, it's a really important point. I was just making a note there about what you said about that ability for people to buy under market, because that's still a goal. I mean, many people look at off-market sales as an opportunity to get in early and maybe get a bargain. But it goes back to that earlier point, Louie, that you made about the amount of information that's available. It's a plus and a minus, because it can be too much information that makes it really difficult to make a decision.
Absolutely, there can be too much, and there can be very much conflicting information.
Yeah.
I mean, without us going a lot into, say, auction clearance rates, I mean, as you know, we have our own auction clearance rate series out there.
Yep.
CoreLogic has their own auction clearance rate series, so does Domain. And all three of us are saying different things about the market.
It's the ability of everyone to collect the similar data. I mean, if everyone was collecting the same data, the results would be the same.
True, Kevin, but I would also argue that methodologies are quite different.
Yeah, true. That's right. Yeah,
and those differing methodologies can give quite different takes on the market.
Hey, Louie, what have been your top takeaways over the last decade?
In terms of the market, I think in terms of outperforming areas over the past decade, Sydney would have to be up there in terms of an outperforming area. Tasmania has also been an outperforming state where investors have done well over the past 10 years, well, certainly since 2015. The market being more sensitive to interest rate movements is definitely something that we need to consider, as well as increased intervention in the marketplace in the form of, say, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, who from about 2014 have been interested in trying to restrict credit where they think that things are getting too bubbly, or loosen access to credit when they think it's more safer to enter into the waters. So I think they are some of the takes. The market overall being more sensitive to these big macro moves as opposed to what's happening locally. I think we've seen that. Of course, your individual regional townships, they've been up until COVID more sensitive to what's happening to those local economies. But since COVID, have been swept up in those macro movements. And this is one factor I'm keeping a strong eye on in terms of what's going on with regional Australia, the regional Australian housing markets. I see grand opportunities and I see grand risks that they've historically been very volatile. We all know that nearly all boats have gone up with COVID, and I just have some concerns that subsequent to COVID, many of these boats will go back down again.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Well, it's a great segue into starting to look into the future then, Louie. What do you think are going to be the likely impacts of some of these trends you're seeing on the property industry and property values over the next 5 to 10 years?
The number one key trend to watch for is housing formation, the number of occupiers per dwelling. Normally and historically, it's been a fairly stable number over 100 years with a gradual downtrend to less people per dwelling. All of a sudden, COVID's come along, and we've seen a dramatic decline in the number of people per dwelling because people have been looking to live with less people. They've been looking to live in regional Australia to get away from lockdowns, to get away with COVID, get away from COVID. Could we now see a reversal of that with the general view out there now that COVID's largely behind us and nothing to be greatly fearful of? And especially with the dramatic rise in rents, could that entice, force people back to living with each other again? And as a result of that, what will that mean for the performance of, say, freestanding houses versus units? What will it mean for the performance of regional housing versus capital city housing prices? These are some of the big demographic waves that have occurred in such a short space of time. And I do think that there will be some type of reversal, but what I can't tell you is the magnitude of that reversal. Maybe it's already starting to reverse now. And maybe what we will also see is a grand opportunity for the regionals that if we don't see a complete reversal where more and more people say, you know what, I like living in regional Australia, I'm going to stick it out, I'm going to make it work, and I'm going to help grow this local town, which I dearly love. I think we will see an element of that. But over the short term, as mentioned before, I think there are risks. And the risks are that given the huge jump in housing prices in many regional Australian townships, even just a slight change or downturn in demand could see a quick fall in those prices. And home buyers of today need to be wary of that. And there are precedents in all this.
Yeah.
Consider the town of Karratha. Of course, a grand mining town, if there ever was one, on the Northwest Shelf.
Yeah.
Karratha housing prices back in 2002 were circa $200,000. In 2011, they were effectively $1 million. And then in 2016, they fell back to $300,000. Okay, you wouldn't want to be on the wrong end of that downturn. And the problem is those type of massive swings could happen in other regional townships, given the boom in demand we had due to COVID. That is the risk. Now, I'm not saying it's playing out right now. I couldn't point to a regional township right now where we're seeing a sudden collapse in demand. I'm not seeing it yet. I'm just concerned about it. And I think home buyers right now need to be cautious of these big movements that happen in regional Australia.
That is that's such a good point you make. Sorry, Bushy, that you make there, Louie. And I wanted to dig a little deeper into that if I could, because, you know, based on what you've just said, and I think that's a key message out of the show, based on what you've just said, how should we be preparing for that? What should we be looking out for?
The leading indicators that will tell you, having a chat with agents on the ground that you can trust, that will help. You know, just watching the listings. So I first noticed a downturn starting to occur in Karratha when there was a sudden surge in listings, when rental vacancy rates started to pick up. You see it in the rental market first in these regional townships, because it represents, you know, the rental market represents really the forefront of the market in terms of what actual accommodation demand's going on. Is accommodation demand increasing or is it decreasing? You normally see it in the rental stats first.
Yeah, I think in the mining towns, we noticed that very much when the mining companies started to build their own accommodation, which took the need off for private accommodation, you know, the rental market.
Yes.
Yeah, so that was a bit of an indicator, I guess.
That's an indicator, but when they did that, the demand for rental accommodation had already peaked.
Okay, right.
And so there were these just dramatic falls in rents. And it fed through into housing prices for the local area about 6 months afterwards. And I think we'll see a similar thing in some of these regional townships. Now, I think there'll be areas which will not be necessarily affected. Maybe coastal regional areas, I think they'll probably hold up better. Now, we're talking overall about this short-term massive wave in terms of the demographic. I think long-term, there are grand opportunities for regional Australia. We need as a country to invest into our regional townships. There's too much reliance on our economic welfare for the big capital cities. And I think long after the three of us actually leave this planet, we will see these regional townships grow and prosper, just like what happened in the United States throughout the 19th century and the 20th century. It'll happen here in Australia. Well, it has to. And there will be great opportunities over the long term. We just need to watch out for the short term. That's all.
Yeah, very good point. I've heard a number of commentators talk about some of the driving criteria that will separate the winners from the losers in regional hubs have been around the critical mass of population in that location, the diversity of employment and industries, and strong and growing incomes that can continue to support increasing prices, where the committed infrastructure and the technology actually enables people to live and work in more rural locations. What's your read of all of that, Louie?
Absolutely spot on. I think without Wi-Fi, the internet being able to reach into regional Australia, and remember, and we still have it today, there are massive black spots in regional Australia in terms of internet, but a number of the key townships now have it. And that's helped tremendously. I mean, remember back when we were growing up in regional Australia, my goodness, many regional townships didn't even have television. We're coming a long way, and we've having good internet now in many regional townships. This will help the local population stay and not be as transient. They'll stick around because they see grand opportunity within these townships and growing populations. So definitely this has helped. And I think we will out of this. I think one thing that there is a permanent change as a result of COVID is the working from home. Now, I know that there are many employers who want to see their workforce come back into the office. As an employer, I'm asking my employees to come back into the office, but not full time, not 5 days a week. I'm asking them at the moment to come back 3 days a week, and then 2 days working from home. Now that can work for someone who wants to work remotely. It can still work. So I think that permanent change is going to help these regional locations.
That's a good insight, Louie, as we would have expected anyway, mate. But we've come to the end of our time together. But thank you so much for firstly, your support for our show over the years, Louie. And it's always great talking to you, mate. I appreciate it. And all the best for you with your reports through Sqm, of course.
Oh, thank you so much. I feel like we've only just touched the iceberg today. I mean, we should. Yeah,
I know, mate. There's so much we can. Yeah, but remember, Louie, we're going to be talking to you in the future. This is not the end of the story, my friend.
No, so absolutely.
I know you can bring a lot to the table. Yeah,
and obviously we should have a good chat about interest rates on another session for your audience.
Yep. Okay. Well, let's make that the next one. We can lock that in for sure, Louie. Good on you, mate.
Thank you, Bushy. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks for your time. And that's where we're going to come to the end of the show. Stick around. Louie and I, sorry, not Louie. Louie's got to go. But Bushy and I are going to stick around and just give you a summary on some of the key points out of this week's show. Stick around. Back in just a minute.
Successful property investment is a game of finance. Do you have the right team and the right game plan? Realty Talk is brought to you by Know How Property. More than mortgage brokers, Bushy Martin and his team of investment architects set you up with a sustainable strategy structured to lower your costs, tax, risk and stress while increasing your capacity for growth. Know How has helped over 1,900 homeowners and investors secure more than $800 million in property wealth. So get set to live more, work less, and live your legacy. Want to know how to invest in your freedom? Visit knowhowproperty.com.au. Well, how good was that? G'day, Bushy. That was a pretty good show.
That was absolutely awesome, mate. Couldn't have brought on board a better bunch of guests to celebrate the 500th show, mate.
Yeah, well, we kicked it off with Tim, of course. And the thing that struck me about our conversation with Tim was he dispelled that myth about the property values doubling every, he said 10 years, but I used to think it was 7 years. And you've since come out with some research that supports that view as well, Bushy.
Yes, well, doing some detailed research over the last 30 years, Kevin, property doubles on average every 15 years. So I think the real lesson there is that the real opportunity and the real results come from property if you hold on to it long term. That also means that if you're doing that, then you're not so worried about when you get in, when you get out, because if you go through a full cycle, then you're going to get the full benefits anyway.
Yeah. I've always held the view that the Brisbane market is probably more stable than most markets in Australia, certainly Sydney and Melbourne. And, I used to say that property values in Brisbane generally did double every 7 years. But Tim pointed out when we spoke to him that it's over the last decade, it's been a 70% growth. So, while it's certainly slowed down, Brisbane is still one of those markets where you can almost not guarantee, but be very sure that the property market just generally rises quite nicely.
Totally agree. It doesn't have the peaks and troughs of New South and Victoria. And Adelaide's quite similar. There's more incremental, organic and gradual growth over time. And for those investors who don't like roller coaster rides, they're good places to stick your money. Yeah.
And then, of course, we caught up with Margaret Lomas, and wasn't that interesting to hear about her new book? That was a total break away from what she's normally done. And what impressed me was that she was willing to say that she made so many mistakes along the way. And boy, can't we learn from other people's mistakes, Bushy? They're the best. That's the best learnings you'll ever get.
Totally, mate. And unfortunately, a lot of investors make a mistake and then throw their hands up in the air and walk away, lose money and never return. But the ones who are truly successful, like Margaret continues to be, is always open to learning opportunities. And it was really good to hear her talk about the whole development experience, because as you and I both know, property development isn't for the faint-hearted, Kevin. And if someone like Margaret, who's had years of experience and leading expertise, to have some challenges there, then it's a fair warning for the listeners to make sure that they're really surrounding themselves with really good people. And have the time to keep an eye on. I think that was one of the key things I picked up from Margaret, was that she's very busy, and if she had more time, she may have been able to condense the time it took to actually get that development done.
Yeah, another interesting point was she said, the importance of family in looking at areas too. And then, of course, we caught up with Louie Christopher, and Louie's never pulls his punches. That's what I love about listening to Louie. He just says it the way it is.
Yeah, I love it. I thought his conversation around, what's going to happen with regional hubs moving forward was very interesting too, mate. There's been a fair bit of conjecture both ways around regions continuing to go ahead versus the boomerang effect of people coming back to the cities. I think in the middle ground there will be regional areas, as Louie's commented, that will continue to do very well. But they need a fair bit of diversity of employment and industry to support it, a bit of a critical mass and population. And of course, there needs to be strong and growing incomes with the technology underneath to support all that. So the ones that have that infrastructure or it's committed will do well. Those that don't have that level of support in conjunction with the lifestyle exercise may have some challenges ahead.
Yeah. Well, mate, that's it. That's a wrap. This is the second in our series as we celebrate 500 episodes. We're going to do one more. And next week, we've got Simon Presley from Propertyology joining us. He's going to be with us for the whole show. So it'll be a three-man show next week. And we're going to, he's done a great job. He's presented some wonderful graphics about the last decade and where we're going in future. And, you know, for all those people who said, you know, property values can't continue to rise the way they've been going, well, we're going to really put that under the microscope. Give it a good test next week.
Yeah, it'll be a show not to miss, Kevin. Always enjoy Simon's analysis. He not only comes up with really good fun facts and proper projections, but it's always quantified on really solid information.
Yep.
So that'll be a show to make sure you don't miss out on.
Yep, we'll do indeed. And we'll be back with you again next week. This is Real Estate. Well, it used to be Real Estate Talk. It's now called Realty Talk. And Bushy Martin is the main anchor, but I've had the pleasure of working with Bushy over the last couple of weeks and look forward to next week. Sorry, mate, you can't get me out of the chair. It's pretty hard. So anyway, thanks for being with us, and we look forward to catching up with you again next week. Thanks, Bushy. See you, mate.
Thanks, Kevin.
Miss something in this week's show or want to catch up on past shows? Do it anytime at realty.com.au, where we connect buyers, sellers and agents differently.